As of the day we are recording this, it has now been 8 weeks since President Trump declared America's opioid epidemic a national emergency. Since then, nothing. No paperwork filed, no formal declaration issued, no new policies announced. But the problem hasn't gone away, and brand new surveys done here at the Marist Poll indicate most Americans are acutely, and a majority personally, aware of how bad this crisis has become. This time on Poll Hub, how America's latest drug crisis hits very close to home. Let's get started. And hello, everybody. This is Poll Hub. We want to start today. We are recording on a day in which there continues to be a huge amount of tragedy and a huge number of people affected by terrible events around the world and in this country. 3 hurricanes, Harvey, Irma, and Maria, and hundreds of thousands, really millions of people still recovering from that. And of course, the greatest loss of life in a mass shooting in American history in Las Vegas. And we just want, as a group, to share our thoughts and our hopes and our prayers with everyone who is infected, and hope that everything will begin to get better for people as quickly as possible. I'm J.D. Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
And Lee Marengoff, and we're here at Marist College, the Hancock Center.
And we do want to talk about guns. The Las Vegas massacre is top of mind and has been top of the news as would be expected. And there have been so many mass shootings over the last decade that it almost seems a knee-jerk default reaction that the media immediately goes into gun control. And probably for good reason. I mean, that's a legitimate question to ask. You have done polling in the past. You've been looking at some of the polls around the gun debate. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I think the lines form very quickly on this, and we see it in the public opinion polls between those who say, this is the time we have to sit down and, address this problem, and the others who say this is not a good time to address this problem. And then the first group then says, well, when is a good time? And off we go on to some other issue. And I think that creates a lot of frustration on the part of people. We see in the polls, though, when it comes to gun control, there's an interesting kind of dynamic here between conservative Republicans who think that the right to protect gun ownership is a guarantee for people, or should be a guarantee.
In the Second Amendment.
Yes. And then there's another group who want to control gun access, which is a policy shift. And we see at that level, it is that at that more broad level of asking about gun issues, Republicans are very conservative on that issue. They do not want to alter anything that comes remotely near the Second Amendment. But we do see when we ask specific things like, assault weapon bans, or registering or not selling at gun shows.
Mental health checks, things like that.
Things like that. When you get specific, there is a shift, and in fact, there's a majority support in the country for making changes.
But why? So those why don't those things ever happen if there's a majority support, even with Republicans?
It seems, and Barb, you should jump in and correct me if you have another view on this. It just seems that on a voting basis, people in Congress know, those who do not want to make changes, that the more broadly stated, we don't want to mess with the Second Amendment, seems to be more of the motivator behind people's votes than a ban on assault weapons.
And I think what we've seen, too, is that this is an interesting issue because it seems that the more things change, the more they stay the same. We look at polling over time, and regardless, really, of the event, and I'm thinking, Virginia Tech, Newtown,
Columbine.
Columbine,
we could
absolutely.
We could spend the rest of this show
Orlando,
listening.
and now Las Vegas. What we see, and what Lee indicated, is that at a macro level, when you ask people, should we restrict gun ownership or not? We see it divided. It's a very polarizing issue. When we drill down to what people would describe as common sense exceptions to that, I think there's a much greater consensus. But one of the things I think that is different about the Second Amendment is that it's something that people can actually personalize. Unlike other restrictions, what comes to my mind is the issue, of terrorism. Certainly, we've had specific rights that have been restricted, particularly with regard to surveillance and privacy. And in a sense, we see those restrictions as happening to other people. In other words, the people that are on the do not fly list, or the people that are suspected of being terrorists.
It's the other guys. It's not me. You're making me safe by taking away some rights from some other people, and that's okay.
Exactly. But when it comes to guns, I think people personalize the Second Amendment.
You're taking away my guns now.
Precisely.
Yeah. So we see a battle here between Second Amendment and First Amendment. And I think people react very differently to those two positions.
The Second Amendment absolutists vote their absolutism, if you will. First Amendment absolutists don't.
No.
Yeah, Jay, that's a really good point, because the Second Amendment does become a voting issue, and I think that becomes a very different issue than for elected officials.
But what you said just a minute ago strikes me that you've done polling on this for a very long time, and at the end of the day, is it fair to say that nothing really changes in terms of the public opinion?
No, I think the public opinion's been pretty stable on this for quite some time, and we don't really see any movement. But I think also Congress knows that. I mean, I think
So that's what I was going to say. Ergo, that's why every time this happens, the reporters and the anchors and the pundits wake up and go, why are we going through this again? Well, because nothing's changing on public opinion, so nothing's going to change in Congress. We want to talk about the opioid crisis. This is something that the president announced back in August, in early August, as a national emergency, and probably some plan is coming, forthcoming at some point to deal with it. There hasn't been a lot of action since, but there's been hurricanes and other things, as we've discussed, that have gotten in the way. You guys have been in the field talking to people about this. This is a major issue for Americans. What did you find?
Well, we took a look at what Americans think about this and what they've been experiencing in collaboration with the PBS NewsHour and a number of special reports that they are doing on the issue. And I think one of the interesting things that we found was that the president is really right on target with this, in the sense that 92% of Americans are aware of the fact that there is a problem with prescription drug abuse in this country. And most Americans feel that this is at least a major problem, if not a national emergency.
Yeah, 26% said it is a national emergency. That seems like a very high number.
And I think one of the reasons for this is because of the fact that it's not just something that people have knowledge or secondhand knowledge about. This is something that about 2/3 of people, just a little less than 2/3 of Americans, know someone who has been addicted to prescription drugs, and we're talking about drugs like Percocet, Oxycodone, Vicodin. A quarter of those mention that it is actually someone in their own family, or nearly a quarter of them do. And I think that this has really impacted communities around the country. I mean, 25% of Americans actually say they know someone who has died from an addiction from opioids.
What I find startling in all this is that this sort of was mentioned a little bit during the presidential campaign. It showed up, episodically, a debate here, a speech there, and then not too much during the latter parts of the campaign. And then lately, you can't open a paper, watch TV news without somebody getting in touch with this issue and trying to. So it's become a major media issue because, as Barb indicated, this is something that does strike close to home. And just in casual conversations that I've had with folks, I mean, there's a lot of people, beyond these numbers, there's a lot of people who know people. And this is, again, the statistics say one thing, and it's reinforced by the fact that this is what people are experiencing in their own daily lives. It's a real problem.
Let me just jump in a second here too, because I think I may have mixed up a couple of the numbers.
Okay.
a majority of people, 54%, know somebody who has experienced it. And then again, about a quarter of those, or a quarter of Americans have experienced or have someone in their own family. But what was interesting, and the number that I confused, is that 64% of Americans say they have been prescribed an opioid. Now, this doesn't have to do with addiction, but it does give you a sense of how pervasive the use of these drugs has been.
But people don't think they themselves will become addicted. So it's, again, as you said in an earlier discussion, it's the other guy who's going to have a problem. But that obviously isn't true, because the numbers are suggesting this is, in fact, somewhat rampant.
There's been some talk about how this compares to the last major drug crisis that we had in America, which was the crack epidemic of the mid to later 80s and early 90s. And it's interesting because there's so many differences. You point out how many people are affected, and actually the crack epidemic affected relatively smaller numbers of people and in relatively different communities and in more isolated communities. I mean, inner city's not isolated, but they certainly didn't happen in as broad a section of the country as this one does. But there are some things that struck me. I went back and dug out some polls from that time, and in 1989, in September of 1989, President Bush, the first President Bush, gave a major speech and announced major policies on the drug crisis that was, tearing America apart. And immediately following that, 64% of the people polled in a New York Times CBS News poll said it was the most important problem facing America. But 2 months later, that was down to 38%, and another year later, it was down in the low teens, towards 10%. So a lot of this has to do with the attention focused on it, just as you said, in the case of the opioid epidemic. And right now, it's white hot, but does it risk falling off? That's one question I have. The other is that at that time, 48% of people polled said they knew someone seriously affected. And that does seem similar, is that 48% of the people knew somebody seriously affected by crack. And in this case, it's a number that's slightly higher, I believe 54%. 54%. Yeah. But that strikes me as the underlying similarity here, is when you've got a drug problem that is as broad-based as these, a president or the government or politicians can't help but act. Yeah. They've got to do something or say something.
And that becomes very important, of course, going forward, because Donald Trump has said this was going to be something he was going to step up to the plate with. And yet some are saying, well, with him, it's not what he says, it's what he does, and there hasn't been the action yet. So stay tuned on this one.
And what are the numbers on that in terms of people, what people think in your poll as to how this will play out and whether it's going to make a difference?
Well, I think what's interesting is this time you hearken back to the late 80s and the crack epidemic. I think this time what we're focused on is really the issue of doctors and pharmaceutical companies, as opposed to at that point where we were looking at an influx of drugs into communities by drug dealers, and a very kind of different approach was then also proposed to solve it as well. So when we're looking back to 1989 and the first President Bush's suggestions, that was policy that was really heavily focused on law enforcement.
Yeah, 70% of the dollars that he proposed spending were going to go into law enforcement, 30% into treatment.
And I think that this time, there is a suggestion and an interest by the public that we have a focus on treatment and how to stop the flow of these drugs through prescription
In
means.
fact, when we asked whether people are doing enough or not enough, the only majority in there was that law enforcement is doing enough. But when it comes to doctors, President Trump, the insurance companies, state government, federal health and drug agencies, Congress, all the rest, they're not doing enough. So they're saying this is still an empty policy.
Yeah, and when you asked if next year Americans thought the situation would get better, only 19% thought it would get better, 32% thought it would get worse, and no difference, 43%. There's, again, a majority, or at least a plurality of people polled who basically don't think there's going to be any difference. That strikes me as similar, again, going back to 1989 and the crack epidemic. That poll, the New York Times poll at that time, 38% said this big plan by the president would reduce the problem of the crack epidemic. 44% said it won't. I mean, it does seem like no matter how much this touches people, there is a plurality of opinion around, you're not going to make much difference.
But there's some underlying optimism that, with the problem being so pronounced and so many people, where maybe someone will step up to the plate, because people do think 63% that it's gotten worse in the last year, and only 2% think that it's gotten better. So people are hoping those numbers are going to change down the road.
I would love to check back on this. I'd love to put this on the calendar, and let's check back on this and see where people are thinking about how big a problem this is a year from now, and whether anything's been done to change it.
Good point.
Good idea.
And we have a guest with us this time on Poll Hub, Amy Chozick, New York Times reporter, who was in deep on the Hillary Clinton campaign and is also writing a book about it. Lee, why is she at Marist College?
Well, this is a great night for us, and we're happy to have Amy here. We love to have journalists come and talk to our students, which she'll be doing later this evening, and to meet with them in kind of more of an informal seminar way. Students do polling, but then also to get the full dimension of what it's all about, that they get to see some of the people who are on the campaign trail. So, for example, they have, in theory, just read Hillary Clinton's book. So I think one of the things I hope tonight we get to talk about is, whether what happened is really what happened as Amy saw it.
That's a good question, Amy. Is it?
Welcome.
It is and it isn't. I think from the very beginning, I think immediately after she lost, the next day when she was addressing staff, Hillary Clinton was talking about the Russians and Comey and sort of these external forces. And so I think it's a combination of, yes, these things contributed to her loss, and she also wants to put out a narrative that it was not any kind of flaws of her or her campaign. That said, she is pretty honest in the book about shortcomings. I think we can't knock her for not taking responsibility.
There are her books out, and there are other journalists who've written books and are writing books. It's a popular topic. Your book is going to be out in 2018, right?
Yep,
and,
spring.
And looking for a title, right?
Yeah, I'm soliciting titles.
Okay. We'll see if we can help with that.
Thank you.
How's it going to be different? What is your perspective? What's your unique selling proposition here that readers are going to get that they aren't going to get from other books?
So my book is very different. I wouldn't even necessarily call it a campaign book. It's a memoir. I covered Hillary Clinton from 2007 until basically her watching Donald Trump sworn in as president in 2017. So that's the formative years of my 20s and 30s. So the book is really a memoir about how this sort of looming figure trying to become the first woman president really impacted every decision in my own life as I was kind of climbing in my own career. So whether that was marriage, when to have children, every major life decision in my 20s and 30s have been sort of overshadowed by the question of, well, what about Hillary? Is Hillary going to run again? You'll have to be on the campaign trail. And so I think it's going to be a little different for people because it's very different. I've sort of thought about it as, if you remember Julie and Julia, about Julia Child and the blogger who was like obsessed with Julia Child, and that is how I've thought about this book. It's interesting. I had a colleague who Jodi Kantor wrote a very good book about the Obamas, and the review by a male reviewer called it political chick lit, which was really diminishing to a very well-reported, interesting, well-written article. And but I sort of thought, well, what's wrong with embracing political chick lit? More women vote, more women buy books and read. This was an unprecedented campaign with a female nominee and a largely female press corps, and I was the lead reporter covering her for the Times. And so I'm sort of embracing the idea that there can be a political book that's written by a woman aimed at women. A lot of these campaign books are like how these guys got inside the campaign to explain great men to us. And so, sorry, long answer to your question, but I do think, and I hope it will stand out.
So what was the biggest impact that Hillary Clinton had on your life?
Oh, it's a really good question. I mean, I first met her in 1994. I'm from San Antonio, Texas, and it's quite a thriving city now, but then it sort of felt like a backwater. We didn't get big celebrities unless they were country music stars, so coming to the rodeo. So Hillary Clinton came in 1994 to promote It Takes a Village. And my mom was a teacher, and in the break room, at lunch, one of her colleagues said, "Oh, Hillary's coming," and people were like, "Why do you want to go see that?" Lefty, commie,
yeah. And
feminist.
Richards was governor, but it wasn't a Democratic state. So.
Right. And so anyway, she took me to go meet Hillary Clinton, and I kind of remembered that, and I think that I'm not unique. I think millions of women sort of saw their own arc in Hillary's career and their own choices in her career, and I certainly have as well.
Yeah, one of the things we saw in our polling, because we've actually been polling on Hillary Clinton going back to the Senate race in New York. So it's
and actually her
As
as
First
first
Lady.
lady,
Sure,
first
First
lady,
Lady,
and healthcare.
Yep. So it goes back quite a while. But one of the things that we always saw about her was this sense of people had this sense of inevitability about her, and that she was always going to get to the next level, and obviously that came about as close as it could be to getting to that. What was the sense on the campaign? Was there a sense that things went south at some point, or did that come really, really late in the vote counting?
Well, certainly when James Comey released his letter to Congress 10 days before the election saying that additional emails had been found, and not only had these additional emails been found, but they had been found on the hard drive of Anthony Weiner. I mean, this was Chekhov's gun for me. I remember, the first Weiner scandal with the mayoral race and Hillary sort of quietly planning 2016 and her aides, even at the time, trying to really control this from getting into her way. And then all of a sudden in the third act, it goes back to Anthony Weiner. It was just really remarkable. And that day, I think, even though the polling showed that she was still well ahead, I think the campaign had Hillary personally, I think, had a real fright when that letter came. That said, through the final days, they definitely thought that they were going to win. I mean, there was never a moment when they thought they weren't going to win. And so, but I do think looking back, that was a real turning point.
One of the things that I love having you here and the pollsters here is that as a reporter who covered Hillary in the 2000 Senate campaign and then in 2008 all over the country as she ran for president, we were probably in many of the same events. The polls became such a white-hot issue in this year. I love the idea of having the pollsters and a reporter who was really deep in the campaign here in the same room to talk about this. So the perception is the broad perception is, the pollsters blew it. That's kind of the public perception, and there's all kinds of reasons why that's not true if you look at the facts. In the campaign, there's kind of a mix of this like love and hate for the polls. What do you say to these guys about the polling from the campaign of being on the inside of the campaign? What do you say to them about how the polling impacted, did work, didn't work, your feelings about the polls and their impact?
She's a guest here, Jay. I think that's probably a rough. No,
it's interesting that pollsters feel very attacked by getting it wrong, because I feel like the media, we of course in the press do as well. I mean, I think that 2016 was a really interesting confluence of newsrooms cutting back, of the availability of live stream and Twitter. I mean, if you remember in 2008, it was like in its infancy, and so there was a perception that you could be in your cubicle in New York, you could be in the green room in CNN watching Twitter, live streaming a rally, and why do you have to be there? I think there was at least in the Times and other major newsrooms, I know that there was much less of a sense of like putting people out in the country. And so I think, and when that happens, you're much more reliant on polling. That's telling you what the mood of the electorate is. And so I would come back from Hillary rallies. I covered Obama in 2008 in the general election. Like, that was a winning campaign. You knew that, And I would come back from Hillary and just tell my editors, I don't know, it doesn't feel like a winning campaign. Like, it's a joyless slog. She doesn't seem to be enjoying this. The crowds aren't great, all of those things. And they'd say, but the upshot gives her a 98% chance. I mean, it's over. And
for our audience, which I think we've emphasized at different points, there were this new cottage industry in this particular election following on Nate Silver's 538 from previous elections. Everybody had to have their kind of, forecasting aggregator, which sometimes involved polls and sometimes involved their special sauce. And one of the things that we always were trying to emphasize was the difference between the actual polls that were done in a scientific way and how places like the Huffington Post had a 98.6%. I think that really drove the perception. But Jay's question, did it drive the perception of the Clinton campaign also into this sense of inevitability that she was going to win because there was a general sense all the feedback was good?
There's two things to that. I mean,
Okay.
first of all, their internal polling was off. So there's the internal polling that was telling her, you're all right, you're going to win. But then I also think that, Hillary has said that she was a victim of the wide perception that she was going to win. And what she means is that voters who didn't like her but also didn't like Trump might have said, well, I don't want him to be president, but I'm not going to vote because look, she's going to win anyway. I would say she was a victim of the perception of her own perception that she was going to win. You covered her in 2008. She became a much better candidate when she was losing. I mean, she really, really got down and related to voters.
That's why that race went as far as it did against
Exactly.
Obama, is because she kept winning states that she shouldn't have won,
and big important
she was great.
States. Ohio,
Yeah.
She won all those Rust Belt states: Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas. I mean, you just saw on and on. Because and I saw her actually in Vegas after she lost New Hampshire, barely won Iowa, lost New Hampshire by 22 points. In Las Vegas, every night she would go down to the basement of these casinos, shake a million hands into the wee hours. I mean, she just turned into kind of a scrappy underdog. And so I think.
Did you see that again in 2016?
I saw it only in Nevada, and then she won the Nevada caucus. It turned things around. She won, she kind of put Bernie away in the rest of the states, and for the rest of the campaign, I thought she very much acted like a front runner.
Is there a takeaway for women going forward from Hillary Clinton in terms of just running for office, or how they are perceived?
Yeah, I mean, Hillary's been just at the center of the culture wars for so long, and I think one of the most critical moments just in my eyes, remember in 1992, she said, I suppose I could have stayed at home and baked cookies and had teas. And she never lived that down. She became an affront to stay-at-home moms and really...
Deplorables was this year's equivalent of
yeah,
that.
basically. Yeah. But it turned out that, she was ahead of her time. Probably 4 or 5 days before the election, Beyonce had a concert for her in Cleveland. And behind the big screen, she put that quote, I suppose I could have stayed at home and baked cookies. She reclaimed that quote as sort of a feminist rallying cry. And I felt like, Hillary probably should have too, but she was so cautious and so scarred. And so, the lesson for women, I'm not sure. There's a lot of them there.
I suspect there'll be a good lesson for our students tonight. And based on this podcast, and we were so grateful for you to come to Marist and to meet with our students, and also to share your views about Poll Hub.
Thanks for having me. It's a beautiful campus.
And remember, she needs a title for the book. So if you've got any ideas, do you want to give your email? They can.
Sure.
Yeah. What's your email?
amy.chozik, CHOZICK @nytimes.com.
And the winner gets
free autographed copies.
Oh, there you go.
Is that good enough?
That's good. And
Wonderful.
and comparing it to Julia, the book about Julia Child, that's great because if you get the movie rights, boom.
Oh, from your lips to Reese Witherspoon's ears.
She's already cast the movie. I love this.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate
Thanks
it.
for having me.
Thank you.
And that'll do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is produced here at the Marist Poll by the Marist Institute for Public Opinion, and our executive producer is Mary Griffith.
And we encourage you to send questions to pollhub@marist.edu. Now, we would like to see a bigger response because we're going to run out of topics at some point. And as
come on.
As the political satirist Tom Lehrer once said many, many decades ago, why am I always seeing the same hands? So let's get some new people out here. It's not a classroom, but we want to be a high-tech new way of communicating. So let's hear from you.
And check us out. Poll Hub is on social media, at Marist Poll on Twitter, Marist Poll on Facebook, Snapchat, and Instagram. And please, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. That'll do it for this time. See you later.